The U.S. Surgeon General's office, the State Department, the FBI, and the White House itself reached out to social media companies, told them who and what to censor. The Supreme Court just ruled that we lacked standing in the case. This ruling guts the First Amendment, makes it utterly unenforceable. The government can willy-nilly go censor whatever ideas it likes on the premise that it is misinformation.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Steve Hilton Show. Big news overnight. We're taping this on Wednesday morning, June the 26th. From New York, Jamal Bowman, member of the squad, defeated in a Democratic primary. As you may have seen, he's been, really losing it the last few days. A wild event, trying to drum up support with AOC and Bernie Sanders. He was cursing, pretty desperate. That was just a few days ago. Didn't do any good. He lost by a big margin to a more moderate Democrat. Now, he's obviously had a very checkered past as a candidate and as a member of Congress. Remember, he got in trouble for pulling the fire alarm to disrupt Congress and so on. But then there's a video of him doing that. He denied it. And then there's the video came out and so on. So he's not exactly an exemplary member of Congress. But the real issue that drove this, it seems, was the Israel-Gaza war, and in particular, his vile anti-Semitism. There's no other way to describe it. He, like the rest of the squad, completely on the extreme far left on this, Israel-hating Hamas apologists. He denied for a while that there was even sexual violence used by Hamas. Despicable remarks, for the last few months on this. And it seems he was punished mainly for that. A lot of money put into the race by AIPAC, the pro-Israel political group there. And of course, you had the Democrats suddenly complaining about big money coming in, big money in politics, as if they don't know what that's all about, when you have the Democrat organizations constantly pushing their agenda with big monies, particularly the unions. And of course, you see it particularly here in California, the teacher unions and others. So when it's their big money, it's fine, but now someone on the other side puts in big money, suddenly it's a problem. What hypocrites? Well, that's no surprise. But here's the thing I want to say about this that I think is important to bear in mind, because, superficially you could say, yeah, this is a good day for reasonable, common sense, moderate people. An extremist on the far left has been kicked out, and that's good news. And so I've seen a lot of commentary about, well, is the pendulum swinging, right? Swinging back to the center in terms of the Democratic Party. We've seen how far left things have gone. Is this a sign that a member of the squad, high profile member of the most visible far left grouping in the House of Representatives, has been defeated? So it's all coming back to a more moderate, reasonable, centrist politics for the Democratic Party. I think that's just completely wrong. I think that what's interesting about this is that finally there has been a rebuke, there has been accountability for this appalling anti-Semitism we've seen on the left, but it wasn't delivered where it should have come from right at the beginning, from the leadership of the Democratic Party. It was delivered by the voters, and that's great. We can be thankful to the voters for holding this man accountable for his appalling, despicable views and the things he's been saying. But actually, where's Biden? Where's Harris? Where's the leadership of the Democratic Party? If you look across the Atlantic and you see, there's an election going on there right now. Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, set for a really big victory in the British general election. Whatever you think about his policies and politics, one thing that was very clear was that when the British Labour Party drifted off into this despicable anti-Semitic far-left swamp, which happened under the previous leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, who went on again to be held accountable by the voters. Big defeat for Jeremy Corbyn, the previous leader of the Labour Party, vile anti-Semite. The new leader of the Labour Party, the guy who's poised to become Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, he's set about right from day one, pretty much, confronting the anti-Semitism very directly and taking it on and expelling members of his own party who had those views, including the former leader, Jeremy Corbyn, who was kicked out of the Labour Party. Kicked out. So in the UK, when you had this similar situation, it was pre the Gaza war. This was just generic, if you like, anti-Semitism and support for Hamas, even before October the 7th, because it's going back a few years. But there you saw real leadership from the top saying, this is not acceptable. We're going to kick these people out, expel them from the party. What's happened here in America all these months that this has been going on, festering inside the Democratic Party? This guy Bowman, but also Ilhan Omar and the other members of the squad, despicable comments for months now. Nothing happening to them. Nothing from Joe Biden, nothing from Kamala Harris, nothing from anyone. I don't even know who the head of the party is in terms of the DNC or whatever. I have no idea where the responsibility lies, but no one's doing anything about it. That's the point. There is no effort made to confront the drift of the far left from within the Democratic Party. And that's why actually I don't think that this is indicative of any broader trend within the Democratic Party. You don't see anyone in the party really standing up to the far left, because it's not just on this issue. I mean, okay, Bowman's been punished specifically, it seems, on the issue of Israel and Gaza, but actually the drift to the far left, the way that the far left activists have infected the entire Democratic Party, this far left faction, has taken an iron grip on the Democratic Party. You see it on every issue. You see it on the extremism on gender. Another example of that this week with Title IX and women's sports, and effectively the Democratic Party now waging war on women for all their talk about the abortion issue and women's right to control their bodies. No, the gender extremists are in control on that issue. You see it on climate, where the extremism is driving policy. You see on so many different issues, the far left faction has taken over the Democratic Party. And so I don't see any sign that it is going back to a more moderate, reasonable position. You don't see any of the presidential candidates standing up. You don't see any movement within the Democratic Party. Previously, I wasn't here then in America, but I've read the history. And when you saw the Democrats the last time when they really drifted to the far left in the 80s and so on, and were losing elections as a result of it, Bill Clinton and a group around him, again, whatever you may think of the Clintons, Bill Clinton really stood up to it and created a whole movement for change to bring the Democratic Party back to the center. That is not happening today. There's no sign of that. None of the people being mooted as presidential candidates, either to replace Biden if he doesn't make it this time, or for next time, none of them are doing anything except pandering to the far left, indulging them, giving in to them, not standing up to them. So, yes, it's a good day, specifically that this one individual has been kicked out, but it doesn't actually tell us anything about the Democratic Party's long-term commitment to a more reasonable, common sense, moderate point of view, because there's no sign of that. And ultimately, that is because right now the people in charge are just totally unprincipled machine politicians who don't really have strong convictions about anything. They just go with the flow and do whatever is politically expedient. And the ultimate example of that is Joe Biden. And so on his watch, I don't even want to say the word leadership. While Joe Biden's there's absolutely no chance that the Democratic Party takes on and confronts the far left that has basically taken over. All right, so for our policy conversation today, I'm really excited to tell you that we have someone who is right in the heart of an issue that is very live this week. We are taping this on Wednesday morning, June the 26th, and we've just heard that the Supreme Court has ruled in a really important case, a First Amendment case about censorship, government censorship. We saw it through the pandemic. It's been a big issue. We've covered it. And the person that's been really at the heart of this fight is Jay Bhattacharya, a good friend of ours. You've seen him on the show many times talking about the pandemic and the vaccine mandates and all sorts of things. Absolute legend. I'm going to call you a legend, Jay, because you really are. You're a friend. But more importantly, for this particular moment, this case, you've been directly involved in it. You've got very strong views. What I'd love you to do is just sort of, over to you, just lay out what this was all about, your personal involvement and your thoughts on the ruling that we had today from the Supreme Court.
Sure, Steve. So, first of all, thank you for that. I'm flattered. Although, I don't. I probably should like to apply that to other people. But let me just say, the case I think is vital for American free speech rights, for everyone's rights, not just mine. What happened during the pandemic was that the government, specifically the U.S. Surgeon General's office, the State Department, the FBI, and the White House itself, reached out to social media companies, told them who and what to censor, on the premise that that their policies that they follow, the school closures, the closures of churches, mosques, and synagogues, the vax mandates, the idea that the masks don't really work that well to protect you against COVID, the idea that that there is such a thing as natural immunity, all those were deemed misinformation by the government. And they reached out to social media companies and told them, you must censor these people and these ideas, and effectively said, or else threatened them, in effect, with regulatory destruction if they didn't comply. The lower courts, when we filed suit, led by the Missouri and Louisiana Attorney General's offices, found that this was a direct violation of the First Amendment. One of the judges in the case called it akin to a government ministry of truth, an Orwellian ministry of truth, with another judge calling it like Al Capone going to Chicago businesses and saying, "That's a nice business you got there. Be nasty if something were to happen to it." Right? Because they were threatening the business of the social media companies. The government was. The Supreme Court just ruled that we lacked standing in the case. What that means is that in order to demonstrate harm, from when the government violates First Amendment rights, you have to show the direct email that's from some government actor saying, censor J or else. The government can now still go and say censor ideas like school closures are bad for kids, and that's fine. They're allowed to do that. That doesn't violate the First Amendment. In effect, this ruling guts the First Amendment, makes it utterly unenforceable, so that the government can willy nilly go censor whatever ideas it likes on the premise that it is misinformation, and it now does no longer. The American people no longer really have the right to effectively criticize the government when itself spreads misinformation.
I mean, it's a really I mean, the way you've explained it there, it is so serious. I mean, the way that my immediate reaction on X was to say this is a pathetic and appalling ruling. It's pathetic because the justice has actually ducked a big decision because of the way they resorted to the standing argument. I want to get to that in a second. But it's also appalling because it's a green light to this Orwellian big government ministry of truth, censorship, industrial complex, which you've been such a powerful critic of. Can I go back to your when you say we, so you were part of the suit originally, and why was it Missouri and Louisiana? How did that all happen? Because that obviously is highly relevant to the actual ruling because the standing relates to the people who brought the case.
Yeah, so the case was brought originally by the Missouri and Louisiana Attorney General's office, on behalf of the people of Missouri and Louisiana, alleging that the Biden administration, the censorship activities harmed the people of Missouri and Louisiana, which it did, because they were not allowed to see honest debate online over pandemic policies. They reached out to me, Martin Kulldorff, then of Harvard University, Aaron Kheriaty then of UC Irvine, and some other plaintiffs, Jill Hines of Louisiana, Jim Hoft, a few others, saying that we specifically were target of the censorship activities because we were saying ideas that the government wanted censored. The evidentiary record confirmed this. Not necessarily by, I mean, in some cases, but specifically by name, right? There's a email from the head of the NIH calling for a devastating takedown of me and Martin Kulldorff,
Yes,
because we wrote this thing called the Great Barrington
yes.
Declaration that you told about, arguing against lockdowns and for focus protection. But the Supreme Court ignored all this and essentially just said that we had not established that we were directly impacted, although they did admit that we were censored. And then said we needed to prove that the government was going to continue to censor, or else they couldn't issue a preliminary injunction against future censorship by the Biden administration. The standard is, and so the lack of standing decision is actually, it's not a content free decision. It's not just punting the case down the line. It's a substantive decision. The substance is that you have to have this very high standard of proof to when the government censors, or else of standing, or else you're not allowed to sue. It essentially means the government can willy-nilly censor ideas, and only ex post, years later, can you say, well, the government did wrong, with absolutely no possibility of redress, long after the government has sort of misled the American people with its censorship activities, trying to say that true ideas are actually false.
How can they say that you weren't I mean, the stand for those who aren't sort of legal experts, as far as the standing point is to say, in order to have a ruling, you have to show that you, the plaintiff, suffered some kind of loss. But if you personally were censored and you've given an example, how can they possibly say that you didn't don't have standing? Or is it that maybe they're saying that about, the Missouri and Louisiana plaintiffs? It's too broad because they're talking about the state and the citizens in general rather than individuals. But for you, you are an individual. It's very direct. How can they even say that?
I mean, I think what they're saying, it's not traceable. There's some very interesting passages in the ruling. I still I'm like trying to absorb it. Of course, I'm not a lawyer, Steve. So please forgive me if I got something wrong on this. But like, let's just say that the ruling effectively says that if we had asked for money as damages for the censorship that was, and the harm that's done to me as an individual by the censorship, then we might have had standing, because there's this possibility of money. But because we were not asking for money, because I don't want to charge my fellow taxpayers for the harm that the government itself did to all of my fellow taxpayers, all of the fellow citizens, right? We're asking for the government just to stop doing the
Yeah.
censorship activities, right? Because we didn't ask for that, therefore we lack standing for this preliminary injunction.
But
It's
it's ridiculous to say that the only form of harm is financial.
Yeah, I mean, the essential, like, the key thing about the censorship, and this is a really important point that I think a lot of people miss. It's not, in the internet age, it's difficult for the government to entirely suppress discussion. Like, you can always put something somewhere on the internet, right? It's always possible to do that. Of course, I've been on your show. I have managed to talk to people about my ideas. So the key thing that the censorship activities by the government does is it puts a cloud of, there's something like wrong with me. The government must if the government's trying to censor me, there must be something horrible about me. I'm a fringe actor. I'm dangerous misinformer. Essentially, it defames the people that are the target of censorship in a way that's very difficult to counter when the government uses this sort of censorship act. It's underhanded, rather than directly addressing my arguments, which the government has absolutely every right to do. Instead, they're trying to use this ad hominem slur, an effective ad hominem slur, by putting labels of "this person's misinforming, you should censor him," and shadow banning me so that I don't have the reach that I otherwise would have. It's a very, very underhanded way of trying to win its arguments, when in fact it couldn't win its arguments because it was substantively wrong on those arguments.
Exactly. And I know for a fact, I mean, look, we had one particular instance of this, you and I, when you were on my podcast, and we talked about vaccine mandates. And you were very opposed to vaccine mandates on the grounds, just to repeat the science here, that the COVID vaccine, was basically ineffective in preventing transmission. So it conferred a private benefit, not a public one. And so there's no case for a vaccine mandate of any kind. Um, so that's true, and it's the and everything we've known subsequently bears that out. This was in the early days of the vaccine becoming available, and we talked about it here, and then we posted it on YouTube, and YouTube censored it and blocked it and took it down. And then we got notes saying you violated our policy and all the rest of it. And then we complained two ways, right? We complained through the normal channels that any other user would, and we also asked we asked you to come on my Fox News show to talk about the censorship as well as the substantive point, and we went to them for comment because we were about to feature the censorship on our show. And so suddenly, and it was an amazing thing. Like, within the space of hours, we got a reply back from the team, the whatever they call it, safety team or whatever at YouTube, saying, we've carefully reviewed your content, and we can confirm that it does indeed violate our guidelines, and therefore it won't be put up. At the same time, almost, we had from the corporate affairs public relations team, who were worried about this all being on Fox News, saying, we're terribly sorry, this was a mistake, it shouldn't have been taken down, it's all fine. And so it's just laughable, really. But the point is that I know, because I had a subsequent conversation with the then head of YouTube, that who said specifically it's a nightmare for us because the government is telling us all the time that we have to do this. And of course, we have advertisers that, we have all these people telling us to, it's a nightmare for us, so it's a difficult situation for them. And so it's just a fiction. The idea that they acted independently, of course, they were the agents of the government. I mean, this is just, and it's been proven so many times. And we saw it. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg said it in relation to the in a different issue in terms of the Hunter Biden laptop. Well, the FBI told us that this was coming, and we had to take. So it's really serious. I cannot believe we're in this situation where the Supreme Court has just given a green light to this.
I think it's a very, very dangerous situation. I mean, what we essentially were saying is that the government should stop meddling in the moderation decisions that the social media companies make. The social media companies have every right to moderate how they want, right?
Yes.
The next door social media company moderates it so that I can't go talk about what's happening in in the Bronx or something because I live in Northern California, right? That's fine. That's a moderation decision that's consistent with what their business aims are. So it's fine. They have every right to do that. The issue is that the government is telling the social media companies what their moderation decisions ought to be. And that is a direct violation. Essentially, the social media companies have this protection against being called a publisher, this Section 230 protection. They're not a publisher. They're just a conduit for the sharing of information. So they can't be sued for defamation or whatnot. The government is saying you must act as a publisher, adopting the editorial decisions that we want you to adopt.
And by the way, they're not even hiding it. I remember during this period, Jen Psaki, or just one example, very famously from the White House podium, said very proudly, "Yes, we talked to the social media companies about what they should take down."
I mean, that came out very clear in the discovery that we've done so far in the Missouri versus Biden case. By the way, that's going back down to the lower courts. So the lower courts, I think, hopefully will start to try to correct the Supreme Courts because I think they misread the evidentiary
Oh, I was
record.
going to ask you about what next. Can we get to that at the end? But
Of
keep
course,
going
yeah.
in terms about the Jen Psaki point. You had a point there about the evidence.
Yeah, so I mean, it's Jen Psaki. There's this man who was the White House advisor named Rob Flaherty. Their emails were like expletive-filled emails where he's like, take down this, I'm not going to use the word on the air, but like all kinds of bad words, saying take down these kinds of ideas or else. The or else is often implied, and you see the social media trust and safety people sometimes push back, say this doesn't violate our policies. Why are you asking us to take this down? And they're like, no, you better take this down. It's going to kill people if you don't do this. We're going to go after you. Essentially, Section 230 reform, meaning it essentially kill the social media company that doesn't comply, and it is absolutely blatant.
There's another thing it just comes to mind. I can't remember the exact details. I did a piece on it on my Fox show, which was the when you talk about the censorship industrial complex. What lies behind that is you've got the government, all these intermediaries, and you had a kind of collection of them. One of them, the Stanford Internet Observatory, right? They were part of this, and I think, and then they had all these different acronyms and different entities. And I remember one of them. They had a report, again bragging about what they did during the pandemic, and I remember the number because it was just very memorable. They said we managed to identify and stop the spread of 66 problematic narratives about COVID. 66. One of them was the argument that the pharmaceutical industry was benefiting financially from the vaccine. That was, as far as they're concerned, a problematic narrative that had to be suppressed. And there were many more. And it was, and yes, it's fair enough. Some of them, they went through all this. Some of them were clearly sort of nutty conspiracy theories about, robots being injected in the vaccine or whatever, But that one I remember very clearly is just a perfectly reasonable point to make. You may agree with it, disagree with it. The idea that that is a narrative that criticizing big pharma for making money off the vaccine should be suppressed by the government is just outrageous.
It absolutely is. I mean, I think actually that points just to a couple of points about that strategy. One that you bring up, Stephen, very appropriately. First, the government used essentially university and NGO cutouts to launder its censorship
Yes.
demands, including, unfortunately, I have to say, my own university, Stanford University, the Stanford Internet Observatory. And then the second point, which is that it will often it'll put in like things that are like obviously untrue that they're trying to censor, 5G or whatever. I don't know, some crazy idea, and then in the midst of it also include ideas that are true, that are just inconvenient for the policy the government wants to put in place. If you've had COVID and recovered, you have some immunity. That's a true fact. But it's inconvenient for the government's policy that says you must get vaccinated or you can't, have a job or life at all, civic life at all, right? And so it sort of launders its censorship demands in two ways. One, by using NGO cutouts, third party cutouts, so it doesn't look like the demands are coming directly from the government, even though they really really are. And then second, by hiding the substantive. Controversial censorship demands in the midst of things that everyone would agree are not true. Most people would agree are not true, and are best dealt with by just allowing the people who believe the false thing to say it, and then being corrected
Exactly.
by other people who are saying, no, that's not true.
So just two questions to end with, on the kind of process here, and going back to the court case. First of all, am I this case already had a positive impact earlier on? I'm right in thinking that when there was the earlier ruling, the Biden administration immediately announced some change of practice. It said it's just stopping conversations with the tech company. In other words, it's almost an admission of guilt. Can you remind me what that was all about?
Yeah, so we had a very positive ruling on July 4th of 2023 from the lower court, the lower federal court. Then it was upheld by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, with an injunction that told the Biden administration they were not allowed to go censor social people on social media. They couldn't force social media companies to censor. That led the Biden administration, in effect, to stop doing it. In fact, they went and complained to the New York Times. The New York Times wrote this sad piece, this chin-pulling piece, saying, "Oh, it's so bad. It's so bad that this court has like stopped the Biden administration from suppressing the misinformers like me." I mean, I read the thing as like as admission of, as just like you did, an admission of
Yes.
guilt, right? But now the Supreme Court essentially has given it a green light.
Yeah.
So we have an election coming up. The election disinformation suppression was actually a major part of the Biden
Yes.
of the Missouri versus Biden case. The It'll be interesting to see how the Biden administration reacts, but I suspect they'll react by spiking the football, saying, "Look, we had the right to censor. We're going to continue to censor," and it'll have a major impact on the future on the election. The case now is going to go back down to the lower court. This was the Supreme Court ruled on a preliminary injunction that told the Biden administration that they were not allowed to censor because it's very likely we're going to win the case. The case will now go back down to the lower court. We're going to get more discovery, so we'll see what other things that they did. Like this was just based on partial discovery. It's really damning discovery, meaning like we can read the emails of the government, and hopefully we'll win that case in the lower courts again, and it's very likely it'll come back up to the Supreme Court in a few years. But in the meantime, the government is going to essentially say we have the right to censor. I think what has to happen next is Congress needs to act. Right? If the Supreme Court's not going to protect the First Amendment and free speech rights in this country, Congress absolutely needs to do that. And every single politician should be held to account. Be asked: are you in favor of government censorship or not? Are you in favor of social media companies being coerced in this way? Down to dog catcher, because it's these regulatory agencies that we're doing the censorship.
So you're saying Congress, final point, Congress should pass legislation to explicitly make this kind of
Make
government
it criminal. Like if there's some
right.
government official that's going to social media companies and saying censor these people and these ideas, and it's not like national security related or child porn related, make it a criminal act to
Very
engage
good.
in that kind of
Well,
censorship.
that is something to focus on, and I can immediately think there are. I mean, someone like Rand Paul comes to mind. There are people who really are strong champions for this in Congress. So let's hope that they act. Jay, thank you so much for coming on at short notice to tell us all about this. Great to see you.
Great to see you too.
Right, California Corner time. Susan Shelley back with us. Second time in a week. We were here for an emergency episode, Susan, talking about the outrageous um, undermining of democracy through taking the Taxpayer Protection and Government Accountability Act off the ballot. It's such a busy week, such a busy time this week and the weeks in the middle of the summer now, because it's all just, there's so much that goes on in Sacramento. That itself, by the way, is, I think, part of the problem, because there's just this extraordinary amount of activity on the budget, on these ballot initiatives, on laws and everything. And no one can really keep track of it properly. I mean, we do our best here, but it's all this last minute negotiations and scrambling around. It just feels like such a terrible way to run things, apart from anything else.
Well, it is. It's all a backroom deal now, and there was an amendment to the Constitution a few years back that said no longer do they need a two-thirds vote to pass the budget because they had had a lot of delays while the Republicans and Democrats fought about things in public. They fought about things in public, and there was a long delay. And so there was an amendment adopted by the voters that said they have to pass a budget by June 15th or they don't get paid. And by the way, we're going to cut the threshold down to 50% plus one vote. So now the Democrats currently in Sacramento have complete control of the budget. The Republicans in this session were not even invited into the negotiations. They read there was a budget deal on Twitter. So there you go. They don't have
I
any
mean,
input
it's a
at all.
one-party state, exactly.
And
So
it's
that
all back.
which one was that Prop 25? Which one was that about the
I
budget?
think it might have been Prop 25. It was
Right.
the On-Time Budget Act or some name like
Yeah.
that.
So 50% in the legislature, they can pass
Right.
the budget. They've just done that. So let's start with that. This budget
Okay.
deal, as it's called.
Okay. Well,
Um,
first of all, they passed their placeholder budget by June 15th so they could all get paid, but that's not the real budget. So now they're doing what they're calling the real budget. The fiscal year starts July 1st. They have to have it done by then. But they do trailer bills, which means they take blank legislation that they passed earlier in the session out of the drawer and they amend an entirely new spending program into it and they pass it after the budget. They call it a trailer bill. It doesn't go through the normal policy committee hearings. It goes straight to the floor for an up or down vote, pretty much. And then it goes right to the governor's desk. So we're never really done with the budget. This goes on all year long. In fact, they just did a trailer bill amendment to last year's budget a few weeks ago, cutting 17, I think it was $17 billion of planned spending in order to ease the deficit problem that they're facing for this year's budget. So they're never finished amending the budget.
it's all a joke, isn't it? I mean, it's
Yeah,
such an amateurish way to do things. I think I mean, that's a whole other conversation we should have at some point about how you would do this in a more sensible and professional manner. But what are the
right.
basics on this budget that's now been passed?
Well, it's about $298 billion, and they're saying it's balanced, but of course it's only balanced because they moved a bunch of the spending over the deadline into the next year. It's full of flim-flams and loans from this special fund to that special fund. And most interestingly, they're taking money out of the reserves for a quote budget emergency. There is no emergency. The emergency is they spent more than they got in revenue. And the question really for the voters is, are we ever going to hold them accountable for these phony revenue projections that enable them to do all this extra spending and then come to us for tax increases? Oh, we have a budget emergency. We're going to drain the reserves, which are for a recession, which technically we're not in yet. And when we are in a recession, then what? Well, I'll tell you what. What's going to happen is they're going to say we need an emergency tax increase because otherwise we're going to have to name your program. They're going to cut the most important vital programs. We have to cut everything if you don't agree to raise taxes. This happened in with Prop 30 under Jerry Brown. That was a real recession, and he said we have to have a tax increase. It was a sales tax increase and an income tax increase to close this hole, or we're going to have to close the schools, cut the schools, fire the teachers. That was the apocalypse if you don't vote for the tax increase temporarily. And then several years later, they made it permanent. They just slipped it through. Well, this is not a tax increase, it said on the ballot. This is not a tax increase. No, no, no. This is an extension of the tax increase they promised you was temporary. But they just flim-flam the voters all the time with
Yeah.
this, and this is how we ratchet up the taxes. And as you know, the Taxpayer Protection Act was just taken off the ballot by the state Supreme Court. That would have given the voters a statewide vote over tax increases. And boy, Gavin Newsom did not want that. So they are
Yes.
planning tax increases.
So much to unpack there. Let's just go step by step. First of all, let's just note that they we pay here in California, when you add it all up, the highest taxes in the country. And they still don't have enough money. They still
Right,
don't have enough to cover all their spending commitments. And so the
right.
taxes are now going to go up again. They ran out of money, even though we have the highest taxes in the country, because the evidence of that is they have to dip into the reserves. Is the reserves the same as the rainy day fund? Is that the same
Yes.
thing? Okay.
Yes.
So
There
exactly.
might be more than one reserve account. I'm
But
not sure about that.
the rainy day basically is Democrats in charge. That's the
Yeah,
rainy day.
you're
Um,
exactly right. We wanna spend more money, and that makes it a rainy day.
It's just ridiculous. But what was so interesting and helpful and clarifying about what you just said, Susan, was that you really nailed the central dynamic here that is so destructive, which is they make these projections and then based of revenue, like we this much money is going to come in from the taxes, from business taxes, and remember, the majority of the taxes are paid by the very, the top 1% of I think is half the money that comes in is paid by the top 1%, and so on. So we got all these projections for income that look rosy, so we can spend away up to that level. Then it turns out the revenue isn't there, and so now we have to borrow from the rainy day fund. Let's unpack that for a little bit. Who makes these projections? They're not. Is this the argument between the governor and the legislative analyst's office? Is that the heart of it?
That's where it happens. Yes, the governor's Department of Finance projects what they think the revenue will be, and the legislative analyst's office projects what they think the revenue will be. And of course, the governor's office has a motive to project more revenue so they can make more promises and spend more money for more constituencies to buy more votes. Essentially, that's all that's going on here. And the legislative analyst's office, they have pencils and calculators and computers, and they're looking at it and they're saying that's a little optimistic. They're always very diplomatic. We think the governor is optimistic. Well, what they mean is this is a flim flam.
Yeah, so that's what's been going on all year, hasn't it? The back and forth about, well, how big is the deficit going to be? And
Right.
there shouldn't be any deficit at all. I mean, it wasn't that long ago. Was it 2 years ago? We had $100 million surplus.
Well, everything was so distorted by the COVID lockdowns because they shut down the economy. And then the economy was allowed to open up and, of course, comes booming back with big growth. And all of a sudden, you see enormous revenue. And they said, as happened during the dot-com bubble back in 1998 or 1999, this is how it's going to be forever. We're going to have $200 billion in revenue forever. And of course, they're wildly off because it's a spike and you can't budget as if the spike is going to happen continuously. But that's what they did. And then, of course, they have to run to the taxpayers and say, well, we're going to have to cut your favorite programs because you don't want any tax increases, or we're going to have to borrow more money, or we're going to have to do something, something, something. And actually, the something is we should get people who are more responsible. But let me tell
Yes.
you something about people who are more responsible. You get someone like John Moorlach, who's in the legislature, and the unions target him and knock him out of politics. And that's what happens to
Well, tell us
people who
about
are
him because I read
responsible.
his pieces every now and again, and I'd love just tell us a little bit more.
Well, that's what happened. He was targeted by the
He was a
unions for
Republican.
destruction. He's a Republican, and he's the person who I believe found the Orange County bankruptcy information and dug
Yeah.
all of that out. He's fiscally responsible. Well, we can't have that in Sacramento, can we? So the public employee unions targeted him in several different races that he ran in, and they drove him out of politics. There you go. And this something similar happened to Jeff Hewitt, who was a county supervisor in Riverside. He also took on the public employee unions. They targeted him. He's not in office right now. So this is the pattern. It's like putting a head on a pike in politics. If you cross the public employee unions, your political career will end. One of the things I noticed in a report from CBS News is that SEIU 1000, which represents the government workers in Sacramento, was so pleased that not only do they have no furloughs of any of their employees in order to get through this budget problem, but also they get to keep their $50 stipend for working at home. I think it's $50 a month for each person who works at home. And that wasn't cut either. So this is the level of control that the public employee unions have over the
Amazing.
budget.
So they so I just want to point out that this drawing on the reserves is a bit like when they say bonds and they call it bonds, but actually it's a future tax increase because it has to be paid at some point and with interest, so it's worse. That's exactly what's going on here with this reserves point. I'm just looking at an email from Govern for California, which is very strong on the public employee unions um, and how they distort the budget. The bad news is that Governor Newsom and legislative leaders announced a budget deal that draws from taxpayer reserves and thereby boosts pressure for a tax increase down the road. Because when there really is a recession or whatever, then they're going to, just as you were saying, Susan, you're going to need to have more pressure on the budget because they've already spent the money that was supposed to be there for exactly that moment. And then the real point, which is so outrageous, and Govern for California makes, and you just referred to it as well, which is the role of the government unions. So the one thing that's not, never mind the 50, I didn't know about the $50 for working from home, but like the massive amount of money that goes in luxury pensions and healthcare, that's never cut, right? They never challenge that. Um,
Right.
and as we always point out when we talk about it, it's not just that it's in excess of what regular people can expect in terms of their pensions. It's way above that. And it's also that it's called OPEB, other post-employment benefits. It's healthcare, not just for them, but all their family members, way above what Obamacare, which they say is the best healthcare and all the rest of it, way above what that is, and way above what you get for equivalent positions, retirees in other neighboring Democrat-run states like Oregon or Washington, way in excess of that. These are huge, huge billions and billions of dollars that are being spent and handed out. It's basically bribes, right? So the unions provide money and muscle and the machine, the organizing, the campaigning for their elections, and in return, they get these handouts.
Right. And they have fought against any changes going forward. I can understand the argument that you don't want to change the deal for people who have already been working
Yes,
and
they were
those were the
hired on
terms.
that basis. Yes.
Right. But you can certainly talk about what's going to happen in the future if you don't change for new employees what those benefits are and how they're structured. But they won't. It's just an untouchable issue. If you want to continue to work in politics, it's an untouchable issue.
It's interesting that you say that it's not just. I mean, it's the Democratic Party. I mean, it's as we were talking about earlier. It's a one party state in effect because of the 50% vote. They didn't 50% threshold for passing the budget. Republicans are way off any kind of strength in numbers. That even the idea that they could link up with moderate Democrats if there are such a thing left in the legislature, it's not possible. And so what is the? I mean, that's why it does connect back to what we were talking about earlier in the week, the Taxpayer Protection Act, because since there's no check or balance on this raising spending and taxes without limit, I mean, what else are you going to do?
Well, the silver lining, if there is one, is that it's clear from polling that people feel overtaxed. It's clear from
Yeah.
the PPIC poll, Public Policy Institute of California, that the numbers on people who feel that they're being abused by their government, that number keeps rising. And it's probably the highest it's been on people who feel they are overtaxed. That is a sobering thing for anyone who wants to continue to have a career in politics, because at any moment you could have a Prop 13 style tax revolt. And it's interesting that they are trying to pass ACA 13 in November, a legislative constitutional amendment that would prevent a Prop 13 from ever passing again. They see this coming and they're very concerned about themselves. They're not concerned about you. They're not concerned about California. They're very concerned about themselves and continuing to have those jobs in politics. It's very troubling for the state of
Yes,
California.
but
It
we've
really
got to
is.
get, I think what a big part of this is shining a spotlight on this outrageous abuse, right? The amount of money that goes into this corrupt scheme of, taxpayers funding these enormous, salaries and benefit packages and so on right across the public sector. I mean, you can see the numbers at the state budget level. It's right up and down government. I mean, just at the local level, there's a story this week in my local newspaper, the Palo Alto Daily News, I think it's called. It's just a stunning story. I put it out on X. Palo Alto in California, in the Bay Area, is just over 67,000 people. That's the population. There are 27 people who work for city government in Palo Alto paid more than $300,000 a year. Like $300,000 in a city of that size. It's just that's nearly 30 people. And so, think about the typical, the median income. What's it, 60, 70,000, something like that? Half the people in California, I believe that's the number, earn less than that. You've got government employees, 27 of them, making over $300,000 a year. I mean, it used to be said that the justification for the very generous pensions and healthcare and so on and the benefit packages was because they weren't paid as much. You go into public service and you work in the public sector and you're kind of making a sacrifice from what you could be earning in the private sector. But look at these salaries. I mean, it's just they want in the famous phrase, they're having their cake and eating it. They want they're at the private sector levels of pay, but keeping the public sector benefit packages.
You know, this is part of a larger picture of trying to separate effort from reward in all things and it's really a breaking of the social contract with the taxpayers. If there was such a thing as a social contract, this would be breaking it. What you mentioned, the people who are working, the people who are pulling the wagon are making far less money than the people in the wagon in terms of public employment. That's a very secure position. And as you said, it was always the good benefits, the security, the pension, but a lower salary. Well, now the salaries are higher than the private sector by a lot. You also have a situation where people who come into the country illegally in California are now eligible for full scope Medi-Cal health care coverage, just like an American citizen who falls on hard times. Right now, we have one third of the state on Medi-Cal because that's the level of poverty in this state. The people who are coming in illegally can have the same health care benefits that a family that is low income in California is entitled to. That's upside down, that the taxpayers of California are on the hook for that 100%. It's illegal for the federal government to pay any of that. So we don't get our 50% matching funds on any of the health care provided beyond the emergency level to illegal immigrants.
That's a great
That's
point.
and then you
Yeah.
have this situation where homelessness is being addressed by creating one-bedroom apartments and studio apartments for people who are on the streets. Doesn't that sound nice? Well, in Los Angeles, there's a skyscraper that was just opened that has 278 lovely individual apartments, a gym, a cafe,
I know.
art classes, all of this. They are living better in that building than the people who are paying the taxes and working two jobs to afford their own apartment. It's not sustainable to do that. The people who are working and paying the taxes can't continue to be abused this way. It's not stable. It's not sustainable. And
Yes.
it has to stop.
It has to. I mean, it, again, lots more to say about it, but the dynamic there is what we need to pay attention to, which is that they have all these policies that they put in that make things more expensive. So just to take that particular issue of housing and all the rest of it, we've talked about this many times. The environmental regulations, the endless, the endless changes to the building codes and all the rest of it conspire to make it more and more expensive to build anything. You talk to people in the construction industry, it costs 4 or 5 times as much to build the exact same floor plan building, whether that's a single family home or apartment building, whatever it is, shopping center, whatever it is, 4 or 5 times more expensive to build it in California than in neighboring states, just across, like literally you cross the border and it's like 1/4 the price, a fifth of the price, I've heard, right? So they inflate the price with all their policies and regulations and so on. And then they say, "Oh, it's really expensive now. No one can afford. No one can afford it. So we're going to subsidize it. So you put up taxes even more." It's this absolutely terrible spiral. By the way, there's a bunch of taxes they put on construction. They call it impact fees. So all their policies make things more expensive. Then they realize people can't afford to live. So then they put in subsidies and handouts, but that costs money too. So it just adds to taxpayers' tax bills going up. I mean, it's just and the final point I just want to make before I'll let you close it out, Susan, is that in the midst of all this, let's just remember the sheer scale of what's happened, this government bloat that's been going on. The number at the top of the show that you mentioned for this budget that's just been agreed, to just under $300 billion. So it wasn't that long ago. It was under Jerry Brown. I looked it up. The budget, roughly halfway through his period as governor the second time round, I don't know, just over 10 years ago, it was 98 billion, just under 100 billion. So they've more than trebled the budget. It's amazing the scale of what's happened.
Well, Gavin Newsom was elected in 2018, and in 2019, state spending just started to take off. And if you look at a chart, it just goes up and up and up and up before COVID, and then with COVID, and then after COVID. It's just going up and up and up, and it's not sustainable. One of the things they've increased taxes on in this budget is businesses. They're eliminating a credit called the net operating loss. And what that means is that an opportunity to even out high revenue years and low revenue years and have credits on that is going away. And the significance is that you have it, you're taking it away, you have it, you're taking it away, you have it, you're taking it away. Businesses can't operate that way. They have to know what their costs are going to be in advance, and they're going to be in other states because why would you take California's word for it that this is what your costs are going to be, this is what your taxes are going to be? Every time they decide they want to spend more money, they come for it and they take it away again. So this causes businesses and job creating businesses to leave the state, to not expand in the state, to not come to the state at all. Jobs decline. A lot of major employers, hundreds of major employers have left the state in the last 10 years because of this kind of thing. And when you do that, wages go down in California. We've just seen that the government's approach to that is to increase the minimum
I
wage,
know,
as they did with fast food workers. Well, what's the result of that? Layoffs in the fast food
I
industry
know.
and higher prices
And
for
you
the
get less
consumer
revenue overall. I mean, the whole thing is
overall.
it's so
Right.
it's so crazily self-destructive. I mean, we need a massive change. We need the California Revolution. That's what I talk about all the time. I think we will get it sooner than a lot of people think. Um, Susan, great to see you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve.
All right, so this part of the show, I normally start getting fired up and ranting about something that I want to get off my chest. But you know what? Let's have a break from that. It's the summer. I'm going to do something positive now because, as some of you may have seen if you follow me on social media, I just got back from a very quick trip to the UK. I went back because I was graduating from Oxford University. And I say that to a lot of people and think, oh my gosh, you've been studying hard to finally finish your degree. No, it's not like that. There's a weird thing. I don't know actually if it's just Oxford or all British universities. I only went to Oxford, but there's no joint mass moment when all the students graduate together. There's no commencement. There's no ceremony where all the families come and watch the people graduate. That just doesn't happen. You have to kind of opt into it. You have to proactively choose to do it. And we never did. And in fact, there was a story which I'd forgotten, but my friends reminded me of as we all got together to graduate this past weekend, which is that when I was there at Oxford, I was there in the late 80s, 1987 to 1990. Um, I by the way, I posted on X the group photo of my year when it's called the matriculation photo, 1987, and I challenged everyone to see if they could spot me. I had hair in those days, so see if you can do that. But when we were there was this famous actor, comedic actor called Dudley Moore. Some of you may know him. He's been in a few movies. Very, very famous in the UK. And he was at Oxford and he came back to graduate. He was just like me, didn't do it at the time, came back to graduate, do the ceremony in his 50s. And this was a big moment. Lots of media there and so on. And apparently I said at the time, that's how we should do it. We should come back later and do it then rather than do it now. I didn't even remember saying that. One of my friends remembered. And so brilliantly, this friend of mine organized for a group of us, 20 of us, to do it together this weekend, to graduate together. We didn't do it at the time. We went back there. It was absolutely brilliant. It was so fun. My mum and my stepdad went. I took my eldest son. We had a really great time. And, you know, I put some photos up and you can see the pictures. One thing I'll do right now is play for you the video because for those of you who think that basically England is just basically one large Harry Potter movie set, this really confirms that. So this is the actual moment when I was officially handed my degree. Watch the video.
Domine praesente tibi hunc meum scholarem Stephen Hilton in facultate artium, ut admitato ad gradum bacularii in artibus, etiam ut admitato ad incipiendum in eadem facultate. Congratulations.
So there you are in Latin. I have no idea what that was about, but very appropriate, I guess you would say, for an Oxford degree ceremony. And it was just a great weekend. And honestly, the best part of it, the really, really, you know, I suppose the main point I want to make is that it was just such a joy to see old friends. And it was amazing actually walking into the room. They called it the robing room, where you have to put on everything. And a lot of these people, you know, we were together there at university for 3 years. I honestly hadn't seen some of them for 35 years, something like that. And it was as if nothing had changed. It was really amazing, actually. Just this kind of instant connection, no awkwardness, no weirdness. Obviously, a lot of catching up to do, but it was just really special. And it reminds us that amidst all the politics and all the stuff I usually rant about in this part of the show, I know it's a cliche, I get it, but it really is true that the things in life that matter are our human relationships. And this weekend was just a wonderful, wonderful reminder of that. All right, everyone, that is our show for this week. Hope you enjoyed it. Always fun to get last minute guests like Jay Bhattacharya when we have a big story breaking. That was a great conversation, a really important one. Make sure you follow us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Tell everyone about the show. We'll see you back here next week for the Steve Hilton Show.